All right, good evening everyone. We're going to get started. Thank you all very much for attending tonight's event, which is called Plant Power. My name's Kalia Primer and I'm undertaking my PhD with the Adelaide Medical School here at the University of Adelaide, and I'm also your MC for tonight. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Kaurna people, who are the original custodians of the Adelaide Plains and the land on which the University of Adelaide's campuses at North Terrace, Waite and Roseworthy are built. Tonight's presentation tackles how we have a growing global population, and more than ever we're facing challenges with our climate. We need nutritious food to feed more people, and yet our food production systems are under threat from all sides. Drought, floods, pests and diseases, and shrinking available land are all stressing humans and plants alike. It's well past time for us to start thinking about smarter ways to feed, clothe and house ourselves without further damaging the planet. So what can we do? Our team here with us tonight believes that Australia has the potential to boast a booming biofuel industry driven by drought-resistant crops. We could even become entirely self- and seed sufficient. So during tonight's event, you're going to hear from our leading researcher, Professor Rachel Burton, as she discusses emerging crops, what else can we grow besides wheat, rice and corn, and what novel crops can cope better with the changing climate. What crops can we think of that are truly multifunctional? Rachel's going to introduce her research and talk about the breakthroughs that she and her team have had since the beginning of this journey, those that lead towards a more sustainable and livable world. Tonight's lecture is going to be structured slightly differently to our traditional Research Tuesdays events. Following an introduction to the research, we've got a panel of researchers here tonight who are going to sit down with myself for a Q&A discussion, and each member of the panel will share their unique insights. But don't worry, you are still going to have an opportunity to ask questions, and we'll be taking questions from our in-person and online audiences. So as usual, I encourage you to submit your questions online via the Q&A section. But let's get underway. So I would first like to introduce you to our initial speaker, Professor Rachel Burton, who's going to kick things off. So Professor Rachel Burton is a Senior Research Fellow at the University of Adelaide. She's been Chief Investigator on 2 Australian Research Council Centres of Excellence, one concerning plant cell walls and one concerning plant energy biology. And she was named a Superstar of STEM by Science and Technology Australia in 2017. Rachel is also currently the head of the Department of Food Science here at the University of Adelaide. Would you all please join me in welcoming Rachel to the stage?
So when I was thinking about talking to you tonight, and it's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you so many people for attending and coming out. I know it's in the middle of winter and we have COVID as well, and we have people online. I thought I might just put some nice little proverbs in here as guidance for the talk. And the first one that came to mind is, may you live in interesting times. Now this commonly is thought of as a curse. May you live in interesting times. But actually, I think I would prefer to live in interesting times than not, because I'm a scientist, I'm very curious, and I love learning things.
All right, so may you live in interesting times, which is a curse, but not for me. And of course, we are in interesting times because we've had to deal with quite a lot in the last few years, haven't we? COVID is the obvious one, and I can see you all wearing masks. But how's that affected our food supply and our food chain? There's big blockages around the world. Lots of the shelves are empty. We can't get shipping containers anymore. We've been forced to look at how our food is grown and where it comes from. We can't pick most of the food that we grow. We've got shortages of people that we rely on. There's all sorts of things that COVID has had an effect on when you think of our food supply, not just our general health and well-being. Then we've got the crisis in Ukraine. Who knew before this that we were so dependent on just one country, which has been called the food bowl of the world? And they grow a massive amount of our food, and we really didn't take much notice. I've been prompted to go and have a look about what happens in the Ukraine, and I've learnt a lot about what they supply and what's going on. And of course, there's all the things that go with that. Gas, etc., all the things that have stuffed up the supply chain. And then, of course, the thing that we've been living with for years is climate change. And as we heard in the introduction, that's going to have a big effect on our lives, and it keeps getting worse and worse and worse. And I feel quite hopeful that we can do something about climate change, but my goodness, it's a huge, huge problem. So the grass is greener on the other side of the fence. Now, what kind of grass am I talking about here? Anybody have a guess? I'm talking about cannabis. So cannabis goes by very many names. My favourite is jazz cabbage. There's lots. We've been working on cannabis for a few years now, and obviously it's a crop that's very in the news because it has so many different uses, but it's also quite contentious. So just a little information about the types of cannabis that there are. You can grade them according to how much it has of this compound called THC. So this is the compound that makes you high. And if it doesn't have very much of this THC, less than 1%, then it's called industrial hemp. So it's not called cannabis at all, it's called hemp. And it's fantastic for food and fibre, as we'll see. We've got the recreational stuff, which is the stuff that makes you high, and that has a really high content of THC, somewhere between 5 and 35%, depending on who you buy it from. And then, of course, we've got medicinal cannabis, which is turning out to be quite amazing. It's got, every time they test it against different diseases and conditions, they find out that it does wonderful things. And I think it has a massive future. That's based on its activity from two other cannabinoids called CBD and CBG, which I won't really be talking about tonight. But it's important to realise that industrial hemp has those cannabinoids in it as well, just doesn't have the THC. The legislation around cannabis is very confusing. It's quite restrictive, and it makes research in cannabis quite difficult. So that's one of the major hurdles that we have to face as researchers, being compliant with the legislation and making sure that we keep all our samples under control. And when I say that the grass is greener on the other side of the fence, we literally have to have a barbed wire fence to grow our industrial hemp behind. So that makes life a bit difficult. We're a bit restricted, and we have to make sure whoever goes in and out is on the list. So cannabis is an amazing plant. It's one of the plants that I call a multifunction type plant, and these two diagrams just show you all the things that you can use hemp for. The one on the left hand side is actually a flyer from a company called Hemp Outer. They're based in Canada, and you can see out of all the things that are listed there, they're starting to make some of the products that contain industrial hemp. But there's a hell of a lot more to go, and this is just really the tip of the iceberg. Depending on who you talk to, you can go from anywhere from 100 up to over 1,000 uses of industrial hemp. And then on the right-hand side, there's a little picture of all the things it gets used in, apart from all the things that they're making in Canada. So it really is massively useful in so many different ways, and it gets quite dizzying when you think about what you can do with it. So we have to focus. So it's one of these nose-to-tail types. Now, nose-to-tail is a phrase that's very often used for animals. When people are thinking about using all the animal, they're going to eat it from nose to tail, or use it, or put it in dog food, etc. And this is actually what I call a root-to-flower type. So again, we're looking at using all of the plant. It's a multifunction plant. It has a very valuable seed, which contains a lot of oil, which is high in omega-3, has the right omega-3 to omega-6 ratio, and it has a lot of protein, almost as much protein as soybean. So it's one of these wonder seeds that I think is going to be very nutritionally important in our future. But it doesn't just feed us. It's an amazing building material, in terms of we can use it to make houses, etc., but we can also wear it. So we can make it into clothes, we can make it into all sorts of things. It's got a huge improvement for huge potential for rapid improvement, and in Australia we are poised to be able to make real contribution to understand the genetics and the physiology and how this plant grows. So that's very exciting for us. It grows very rapidly, and it smothers weeds if you grow it in a rotation. And the signs are good that the water use is modest. In fact, we've tested it now, and it will grow with ridiculously small amounts of water. Granted, this is in a greenhouse, but we've found that hemp will grow with 5% soil capacity. At 17% soil capacity, wheat doesn't do very well. In fact, it probably dies. So you can see that there's a big potential here. Now, of course, that isn't in the field, and we have to translate those findings into the field. So it's an ideal protein candidate, as I've told you. And if we can get the legislation changed in Australia, and Australia's being reasonably good about, they're not too far behind everybody else. In fact, in some ways they're leading. If we can change the legislation so that we can use this plant in many more of our food sources, then I think that will make a big difference. Now, of course, hemp has been around for a long, long time. And this lovely picture, which is from the Henry Ford website. Henry Ford was a visionary, and he built this car. He realised that we needed to use the products that farmers were making, so not just food, but all the other leftovers, to be more sustainable. Even in 1941, he understood that. So this is his car. Now, it's been misappropriated by so many people. So if you go to the website, for example, it's called the soybean car, but it's also been called the hemp car. Now, when you do the maths, it's only got 7% hemp in it, but, that's all right. But the point is, it's made of plant material. So it's a plastic car it's got a tubular steel chassis, but it's essentially a plastic car. And there's a very famous activity. Henry Ford used to like to go and hit the car with a huge rubber mallet to prove that it's much stronger than steel. So even at this early stage, we knew that hemp had a massive potential. There are buildings around in the world now that are using hemp, and this is Marks and Spencer's. So this is one of their flagship supermarkets. It's in Cheshire in the UK, and it's the biggest Marks and Spencer's in Europe. And it's built from hemp cladding. And it was finished in 2013, and they've been testing it now for the energy usage. They predicted it would be really energy use efficient, and it's way, way, way better than they thought it would be. But it's an amazing building, and I think I'm going to go and visit it if I have a chance. The other building that's built of hemp is this storage facility in the Science Museum in the UK, and they've used hemp because hemp breathes. It controls the humidity very well. It's a very good insulator. It's also fire retardant. Now, doesn't that sound like a good idea in the Australian hills, in the Adelaide hills? We have to deal with fires more and more, and maybe we should be thinking about using materials that are naturally much more fire retardant. So I love this quote. So this man is a folk singer, but also an activist. And there's a lot of R words in there, but I agree with all of them. He basically is saying that we should be very smart, much smarter about what we do with our natural materials and the resources that we have in the world. This is a horrible picture. This is plastic waste. And we're all familiar with this. So there's all sorts of things in there, although I was amazed to see that plants are still growing in this pile of plastic waste. They're tough things, plants, aren't they? So plastic is a massive problem in our society, and we need to be able to either recycle the plastic that's out there or make much more sensible choices about using materials that can replace plastics. This is a lovely video that James has given me. Has anybody got a clue what it is? It's actually a seed. It's a basil seed. And we've put it in a solution that stains the mucilage that's coming out of the seed coat. So all those little wiggly pink things are mucilage. So that's polysaccharides. So they're strings of sugars that are coming out of the seed. And the reason this is relevant is because there are lots and lots of seeds that we grow and eat and use that have this mucilage on the outside of them. But we don't use it very much, and maybe we should be using it more. So when we think about seeds that we could use to provide us with feedstocks to make alternative plastics, then this is the kind of thing that we're talking about. So we can use polysaccharides, so sugars, or oils, alternative oils, to make plastic products that are sustainable, renewable, and that break down properly. We're working on a range of these in the group. So you've seen the basil seeds. We don't actually work on the basil seeds. I just put that in because it was pretty. But we're working on a number of different crops. So this one here on this side is a crop called wild sage. So it's actually sage, which is the herb it's related to sage, which is the herb you cook with. And it's also in the same family as chia. And I'm sure quite a lot of you are familiar with chia. And if you eat chia, you'll know that it goes all gluggy, a bit like frog spawn. And that, again, is the mucilage. Oh, it sounds really attractive, doesn't it? That's the mucilage on the outside of the seed. Now, that's good for human fibre, but it could also be very good to make alternative plastics with. And so we're starting to look at these seeds and crops to see if we can use the materials to basically replace plastics. I've told you that hemp is full of oil. It's got 30% oil. That's quite a lot. So it's an oil seed. Again, can we use that oil as a replacement for the crude oil that we're currently using? And the one on the far side is plantago. You probably better know it as psyllium. So that's a dietary fibre that we use. But again, is this a material that we can use instead of plastics? It's used in all sorts of things, mostly at the moment in things like gluten-free foods, but it's also a drug disintegrant. It can be used as a tracer for MRI scans. And again, could it be used to make plastics and other packaging materials that would be better in the environment and would break down much more quickly? And you can see that there are indeed quite a lot of these products starting to appear now. And some of them, unfortunately, are made of polylactic acid plastic, which you're told is compostable. Well, unless you've got specific conditions at home, it's not compostable in your garden compost heap. And so we're very interested in developing materials that you can just compost at home and will break down very quickly and easily. And the types of films, so if we can make a cling wrap film, a replacement, for example, and we're going to start trying to use those mucilages off the seed to do it as a feedstock, then we're very interested to see how strong and how long they last. All right, Dr. Zeus, you have brains in your head, you have feet in your shoes, you can steer yourself any direction you choose. So this is telling us that we have a choice about how we can use the natural resources around us. And this is where the biofuels comes in. So working on plant cell walls are made of carbohydrates or polysaccharides, and that's basically sugars joined together. So you can ferment sugars, and we're very familiar with fermenting sugars because we make alcohol. We make beer out of the starch in barley and wheat, and we make all sorts of other spirits from sugars in other plants. So we're very passionate about being able to find a source of renewable biofuel that is going to be much better, that can fix carbon as it grows, so it can take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and therefore when you use it, it's going to be carbon neutral. On the left-hand side at the top, we have agave. So agave is a succulent that grows in hot and dry conditions. It loves it hot and dry, although it loves it in Queensland as well, where it's hot, dry and wet, and it grows really, really fast. And that's actually a picture of the plantation of the Top Shelf International, who are one of the companies that I'm working with. And agave is traditionally used to make tequila. But we don't have to just use it to make tequila. We can use it for all sorts of other things. We can use it to make biofuels. Fermentation is the same process. And again, it's a crop that is fire retardant. So if we can use it to make natural hedges, for example, we're going to have much better fire protection for stock, and it's not going to catch fire. And if you silage it, the stock love it and eat it. We can use it in human food as well. So it's, again, another one of these multifunctional plants. And Agave caesolana, which we don't actually grow very much now in Australia, is the source of much fibre. So we used to make sisal and ropes out of Agave sisal. So it's got really valuable fibres in it as well. Then, of course, you've got hemp. Well, we know what we can do with hemp. I've just told you about all the hempcrete and the clothing that we can make from hemp. And at the bottom, you might recognise some of these people. We have sorghum. Now, sorghum is a cereal. It's related to plants like wheat and barley, millet, those kinds of crops. This is sweet sorghum. So it's actually much closer to sugarcane. And we use its stems and fibres as a renewable resource. It grows to something like 4.5 to 5 metres in South Australia. This is actually on the Waite campus, this picture. And in just the short growing time, it will get to that high. Now, it does use water, but again, if you grow it in places like Queensland, for example, you can get away with it being rain-fed. What's happening now is that crops like this are being grown to make pellets. So you take the biomass, you grind it up, you make it into pellets, and the Japanese are now putting in huge orders for pellets to replace coal. They burn this in their electricity generating stations. Why can't we do that? They're swapping right over. So I think we should be a lot smarter about how we're using these resources. And basically, you can do that to any biomass. You can make it into pellets. But we need the technology and the infrastructure available to do that. This is one of my favourites. It's not my very top favourite Blackadder quote. That concerns a turnip. Some of you might know which one it is. But this one, needs must when the devil vomits in your kettle. And really, needs must. We've got to that stage where needs must. We need to get a lot smarter about thinking about how we live. So one of the big questions that we're going to have to face is not only do we need really valuable, really nutritious food, not just enough of it, it's got to have the right nutritional profile as well. That's what food security means, enough and of good quality. And one of the things that we're going to need is protein. So where is our protein going to come from? At the moment, we're quite dependent on stock, on animals. That's where a lot of our protein comes from. But there are so many other sources of protein out there. Maybe we should be really thinking about where else we need to get our protein from. And if you'll forgive me for saying this, the average age of this audience is reasonably old. And protein levels in food in aged care institutions is critical. If you don't get the right types of protein as you age, then you can get lots of health issues, sarcopenia, for example, and other things. And providing good food, healthy food that aged people want to eat is going to be a major issue. And we can't keep ignoring the fact that, there's a crisis in aged care in Australia, and one of the things is good, healthy nutrition for that section of the population. So we can get protein from vegetables, from plants, from legumes. Legumes are an amazing source. And one of the things that's been developed is using soybean and faba bean, for example. So this is a Rebel burger shown down here. This is made of plant material, and apparently you can't taste the difference. I actually have never had one. I should. That's a failing, isn't it? I should do my research and go and have one. Anyway, I'm not a big burger person. So, but the products that you can now buy containing plant-based protein, plant-based meat, is massive range now. You go in any supermarket and you can find a huge range of these products, and they're getting more and more popular. And so there's a real need for this. And maybe we don't need to get rid of animals, of course, but we need to think about how we can more carefully grow plants where we can supply protein in areas where stock are not viable. And hemp is one of those amazing plants that has high protein again. So we should be thinking about things like hemp seed, not just legumes, etc. So life is trying things to see if they work. That's a very good message to live by, I think. So I'm sure you're very familiar with these, and I'm sure that some of you eat prawns on a regular basis. If you landed on this planet from space, Do you think you'd eat prawns? They look a bit scary, don't they? They've got all those legs and tentacles and things. And would you eat snails? They kind of slide around all over the place and they're a bit slippery. But these are things in our diet that, because we're grown up, we grow up with them, our parents eat them, they're seen as, perfectly healthy, nice, even some luxury items. We have no qualms about eating things like this. So what we have to do really is think about other protein sources, not just plants. And if we're going to feed some of our waste products, or we're going to recycle some of the waste products, then maybe what we should be thinking about is making some valuable protein using some of the waste products from agriculture. So we have a lot of waste from processing of grains, spent grain in the brewery, waste restaurant food, etc. So wouldn't it be good if you could feed that to a system that converts it into a very high quality protein and oil source? And what do you know? We do. So these are black soldier fly larvae, and they consume all the waste from agriculture, restaurants, etc. And at the end of their life cycle, they make a pupae, and that has an incredibly high protein and oil content. Again, it's very valuable protein. At the moment, we're putting it into dog food, not human food, because in the West we have a yuck factor, and we can talk about this a bit later. I think if it was ground up and put into things, then maybe that yuck factor would be something that we could get over. In other cultures, eating insects is seen as perfectly normal. So again, can we use and employ this cycle to do sensible things with things that are left over? And I would argue that they're not waste. They're actually just food sources for other systems. So I quite like this proverb. Do not go where the path may lead you. Go instead where there is no path and leave a trail. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to leave a trail. We're trying to trailblaze so that others can follow us. And I guess some of these things are summed up on this slide. So we need a better integration of how we grow and use plants, because that could really reduce the impact on our planet. And we seriously need to do something about climate change quickly. We need to think differently about what a crop is. I've shown you a lot of examples of different plants that we work on. Some of them are starting to be recognised, and some of them are just at the beginning of their journey. But there's no reason why, in 10 years' time, some of those can't be crops that we just look out into the Australian landscape and it's perfectly normal to see them growing there. I hope so, because by then I will have retired. We are not currently making the most of what we grow. We waste an awful lot. We need to be more inventive, and we need to close the sustainability loop. So we need to think very carefully about the resources and things that we have and where they can go, what we can use them for. And that's, where our young brains are going to help us out. I'm not saying that much of this is going to be easy. In fact, most of it's going to be pretty hard. And in fact, a lot of it is driven by money. And there's never enough money to do stuff that's a bit out there, a bit on the edge, but we have to start doing it. Otherwise, we're going to get in real trouble. I would really like to acknowledge the wonderful, wonderful people that I work with. I have a superb group. They teach me something new every day, and I love going to work. They're very talented, and they are making all sorts of strides in these areas that I've just been talking to you about, both my staff and my students. I'd also like to acknowledge all my industry partners who work with us. It's really good fun, and we do all sorts of stuff that I could never have imagined 10 years ago. And also we've been very well supported by the Australian Research Council in terms of funding. So thank you very much. I'm sure there's some food for thought there.
All right. Thank you very much, Rachel. That was such a fantastic overview of all the work that your group is doing. We're now going to move on to our Q&A panel session. So I'm going to introduce our panel members now, and some of these researchers who have been integral in the research that Rachel has presented so far this evening. So first on the panel we have Professor Kerry Wilkinson from the University School of Agriculture, Food and Wine, who is a leader in sensory evaluation, food science and wine chemistry. She received a South Australian Young Tall Poppy Science Award in 2012 and the 2006 Science and Innovation Award for Young People in Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry. Thank you for joining us. The next is Professor Rachel Ankeny, who is the leader of the Food Values Research Group at the University of Adelaide, current president of the International Society for the History, Philosophy and Social Studies of Biology, and a fellow in the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And to round out the panel, we have Dr. James Cowley, who completed his PhD in the study of natural variation in the seed plantago genus as a source of novel food ingredients and nutritional supplements. And he's currently a postdoctoral researcher who's developing breeding and characterization techniques for elite psyllium. James is also passionate about science education, science communication and citizen science. And in 2017, he was honoured to be recognised by the University of Adelaide for his work with the Children's University Regional Lecture Series program, and was also awarded the Vice-Chancellor's Student Volunteer of the Year Award. And tonight he's also been gracious to join us in our panel discussion. Please do join me in welcoming our researchers. Okay, now I don't love this microphone situation that we've got going on, but I'm going to come sit down with you guys. We're going to work through a few of the pre-submitted questions that we've received tonight. We've had several submitted from people who have signed up to watch the lecture. But I might kick us off with one that you sort of touched on a little bit, Rachel, which is that, I think we've all probably been sold on the many utilities and the many uses of hemp. So why isn't it being rolled out worldwide in all these fantastic industries? Can you tell us about some of the challenges there are there?
So one of the major challenges is the legislation. It's very confusing and it's very inconsistent. So even amongst the Australian states, you can have a different amount of THC in the crops that you can grow as industrial hemp. So as a grower, that's quite frightening. So if you're going to invest money in a crop and you're told that if your crop goes hot, if it goes over a certain percentage of THC, it has to be destroyed, then that's something that you're not going to be very keen to risk. And for that reason, we're trying to breed lines of industrial hemp at the moment that have no THC and so won't do that. The other thing is that we lack infrastructure in some places. So obviously there's a massive explosion of cannabis and growth of cannabis in North America. China have been growing hemp for a long time and they have infrastructure that they can use to process it. And when you're thinking about fibre and building materials, one of the big blockages or bottlenecks here is actually having infrastructure to take the very tough stems and break them down into the parts that you need. And so unless we get infrastructure that the farmers can easily access, and they don't have to drag everything hundreds of kilometres to do it, then that's going to be a bit of a blockage. But I think that's going to unblock pretty soon. I'm very hopeful. There's a groundswell of certainly in Australia of people wanting to use this material and being willing to invest in that infrastructure. But I think hemp's been a sort of dark, it got prohibited for a long time, so now it's kind of catching up. So it will catch up, I think.
So has your group done any work to understand what that market looks like, and is there anything you can tell us about that landscape, or any sort of have you come across any attitudes that have been difficult to overcome in consumers?
Yes, so consumers I think very often are not quite clear that if they eat hemp products, whether or not they'll ingest THC and become high. And that's an issue because it has an effect on you, but also you're not allowed to drive and all those things. So I think we need some messaging out there to reassure consumers, but that this is not going to happen. I think that's probably one of the main ones. And Rachel may have a
I mean, we know more generally from lots of research my group's done, but lots of other research, that people tend to split into different kinds of groups. And in fact, Kerry and I did some research on this with consumers, potential consumers for insects. Many people are neophobic, so they don't like to try new things. And other people are really fond of trying new things. And you probably have these people in your family or in people that you go out to dinner with or whatever. People try new things just for the sake of. And then there are a lot of other people who are really hesitant to do that. They really like what they know. And I think whenever you think about developing new products, particularly sort of in the food and drink arena, you always have to keep in mind there's going to be different segments for different sorts of things. And it's not necessarily straightforward. So not really correlated necessarily with age or gender or anything else. These are much deeper kinds of trends, probably due to our biology, our upbringing, the traditions we're familiar with, and so on. So do you want to say a bit more, maybe, Kerry?
Yeah, one thing we found with edible insects is people tend to have these preconceived ideas. So there's absolutely a group of people that really don't want to try eating insects. Then you've got other people on the other side who are quite open to trying something new. But what we have found is that one of the biggest ways to break down these barriers is simply giving people a chance to try insects so they can taste it and go, oh, that actually wasn't so bad. Maybe I could eat insects. So that opportunity or that education, these might be the interventions that help us break through and see some of these products actually get out on the market and become more successful.
And I actually think that that's completely true for plant-based foods. So we have a massive choice now when we go in the supermarket, but one of the big breakthroughs with the Rebel Burger was ridiculously, to my mind, but maybe I shouldn't say that because I'll get sued, was making it look and taste and bleed like meat, because people felt like they were eating, they wanted that so there's a compound in plants that they used to make it look like it had, blood in it. So there you go.
Exactly, where it all depends on who you're appealing to, right? So many vegetarians, vegans, and so on hate those products because it encourages kind of mimicking the blood and all the things that they, particularly people who are animal welfare associated vegans and so on. And I think if you're concerned about multinationals, a lot of those products you show really problematic because they're being made by very big companies that are in fact the very same companies lots of people have problems with. Hopefully nobody will sue me for that, but without naming particular companies. And then the other thing is the waste. You look at what you showed. A lot of these new products come with tons of packaging and tons of waste. And many people push back and say, no, we really should be teaching people to work with whole, grains and legumes and fruits and vegetables rather than these highly processed sorts of things. So, the devil's in the details, which kinds of plant proteins prepared how, by whom, for what. Yeah.
That's a really interesting question. So one of our pre-submitted ones is from Lyndon, and they ask, with the re-emergence of traditional fibres onto the market, how do these examples of agave, plantago, etc., hope to compete with the old methodologies, especially when, as you say, there are these huge, big corporations that have been doing things one way for so long?
So by fibres, I assume we mean fibres that we wear? Is that?
Doesn't say, but possibly, yes.
So fibres that we wear, a lot of it is dominated by cotton, but we also have obviously wool fibre in Australia. So there's a big difference between where they come from, obviously, but there's also a big difference in water use. So that's something that we're going to need to start thinking about in terms of, how much water does it cost to produce the fibres that we're wearing. Hemp fibre is amazing in terms of, it actually doesn't have to be washed that often. It breathes. It's really nice to wear. But again, we're not used to it. And I think people think of hemp and they think scratchy, but it's not. So and I think that, again, perception. Is you need to be able to try it, and if it's too expensive, so I think we'll start to see, and I'm not suggesting that we wear sisal clothing. It's all right.
No, absolutely. Yeah, we'll just have to give it a go. It has to be available to at least try.
If you want a hair shirt, then that might be the go, but...
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So another question from David is, how do you intend to convert the biomass to biofuel, and what types of biofuels are you envisaging? And this, I think, ties in really nicely with what you mentioned about, was it Japan that's importing those fuel pellets to be used to produce fuel? I'm really interested to hear a little bit more about that process and how that works.
So, I mean, it seems a bit ridiculous that we're growing things here, chopping them up and then making them into fibre, and then we basically have to ship the pellets by sea over to countries like Japan. We should be using it here, and obviously, there's a big contentious debate about gas at the moment. Coal, we need to find alternatives for these. We have a massive amount of biomass on this planet, so who's counted it really? But 180 billion tonnes of cellulose is made every year, and cellulose is the main fibre in plants, main polysaccharide. We don't use it. Where does it go? It sort of piles up and composts and all those things. So maybe we should be a bit smarter about using that. Now, biofuel technology has been around for a long time. The country that does it best is Brazil, but they grow masses of sugarcane specifically for this. Again, it's one of those things that there's a price point to get over, and the technology is there, but sometimes it's not economically viable. When it becomes economically viable, I'm sure that there'll be a lot of investment suddenly in it, and maybe it will take things like the gas crisis as an example to actually make people realise that we have to start doing this thing, and the value is not just in the money, it's actually in the climate and what we're doing to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Another question we've had pre-submitted is, does this option, or the option to grow new crops like these, is it an option, a viable option for farmers, given that the Labor government has promised to stop live export? Not 100% sure about the clarity on that policy, but
having looked at this before, they're saying, could farmers pivot? So let's say, should we be incentivizing farmers away from certain sorts of things? And I would add not just perhaps live export and those concerns, but more generally around crops that aren't as sustainable, aren't as, good for the environment or good for the land or whatever else, to some of the crops that you're suggesting. That was my interpretation, Rachel.
Yeah, I would agree.
Rachel B,
that's
sorry.
the question. Yeah.
And James, do you think that something like plantago is a goer in this country? I mean, what would it take for growers to be able to start growing a crop like that?
So plantago is currently being developed to be grown as a crop for Australia. So we work with the Frank Wise Institute, who are in Kununurra in far northwestern Australia. And they're making a lot of advances in extension to local farmers who might be interested in growing novel crops that potentially have high value, and also crops that people have interest in buying because they have local provenance, I guess. We did some commercialization research as part of our Plantago project, speaking to farmers about what they would be interested in. And actually farmers were a lot more open to adopting new things, particularly if they have multiple uses. And so the root to flower model is also particularly interesting for farmers, where if, say, the seed is not great, you can still use it for fibre or vice versa. So things like that.
Absolutely. So maybe we'll finish up with one final question for our panel discussion before we move into the audience Q&A. And it sort of, I guess, ties in with what you've mentioned with farmers getting involved with these new crops. Is there any way that people who aren't farmers can get involved with any of this research at all? Can they be growing things at home? Is there any sort of work being done from a citizen science perspective at all?
I think one of the things that people can get involved in is at the university level, so helping with sensory testing and things like that for being able to show that these products are edible and good food options, and so getting involved in and just going to the shops and trying new things that might have some sort of sustainability benefit.
we do maintain a sensory database of people who might like to participate in our various trials, whether it's an online survey answering questions or coming into our Wait campus and tasting different things and giving us some feedback on those products. So there's definitely ways people can get involved.
Awesome, great. So you heard it here first. If anyone's interested in trying some interesting new foods, I'm sure you can get in touch with the team. All right, so thank you all very much for sharing your insights and knowledge tonight with our panel discussion. I'm now going to kick off our audience Q&A portion of the evening, so I'll invite all of you to remain up front. Now, we do need to get a microphone to Liz so she can run around or rove around and ask people in the audience their questions. So maybe if we can grab one of these, and then I think we can share 3 between you guys.
Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation, but I can't see the virtue in sending biomass in various forms, including seed pellets or whatever, over to Japan to help them not use coal. They all end up in CO2, and I was just wondering, is there a particular virtue in biomass in this regard?
It's an interesting question. Any particular benefit from using the biofuels?
So at the moment, Japan are basically trying to replace coal, and this is maybe a stopgap solution that they've come up with. Obviously, they have a lack of land. I think we should not be shipping it. We should be using it here. We should be growing crops that we should be replacing coal use here. I think probably if you look at the economics and the life cycle analysis, then it probably would come out as CO2 neutral at least, but you'd have to do the sums. But it doesn't make sense really. But when you think about what we've been talking about tonight, where you've got to do new things and you've got to show that there's a way, well then maybe the value is in actually showing that you can think outside the square and that you can do these things. And it's not, sometimes it's not obvious, but if you can blaze a trail, others can follow.
Yeah, that's a great question. Can I just clarify, just for my own understanding, really the benefit from producing biofuels isn't necessarily that burning the biofuel produces less carbon, but the fact that you've produced it in a carbon-consuming way that makes it carbon neutral. So actually producing the biofuel is through growing plant material that can...
So when you dig up fossil fuels, which are plants that grew, or algae that grew many millions of years ago, you're essentially releasing CO2 into the atmosphere. If you grow plants now, they fix carbon dioxide, and then you use them, they release the same carbon dioxide, so you have a net. Yeah, so fossil fuels are essentially carbon dioxide from the past that comes back to haunt you.
I get it now, thank you. Another question up in the middle there.
I'm just wondering how much research has been done into commercialisation of Australian native plant foods, particularly the nutrient-dense sort of grasses that grow in the arid zone and those sort of things.
I'm probably a good person to answer that one. So my PhD was about commercialising Australian native varieties of the psyllium that we were talking about. Psyllium's native and mostly grown in India. But what we found was that Australia is obviously a very diverse environment, and the plants that grow all around it also have diverse nutritional profiles that can be used for different things. So we found that a lot of our Australian native plantago seeds were very rich in omega-3 fatty acids and protein, and they are also very good at fortifying and bolstering foods that already exist. Sometimes it's difficult for people to take on an entirely new food type, but if you can fortify it with things like omega-3, people are often more willing to try and take a supplement that's in that form. We're really only at the very sort of beginning, I guess, with our Plantago project, but prospecting for native plants is definitely a key area of interest in our group for sure.
So I helped to supervise an honours thesis recently by a woman called Audrey Henry, and she did a really big inventory of everything that's sort of ever been looked at, talked about, and so on. And it was shocking how little research there actually was on so many of things that are native to Australia. And even where there was research, a lot of it wasn't in Australia, which was sort of odd. And I think although there's a growing industry, particularly from within Indigenous communities or Indigenous-led initiatives, it's still very nascent in this country, and therefore having enough crop to sort of grow of any sort at sort of a commercial level is extremely limited. So what we usually see are, very small quantities presented in teas or as herbs or spices or whatever else, because you can't actually, do it at a level that it would be a crop or a main, something like to replace a commodity. So I think here there's a lot of groups looking at ways to turn that corner of both producing the quantity, the quality, but also some sort of certification, both of what it is, its nutritional qualities, and also who's benefiting. So making sure that the Indigenous communities that participate in producing the products are getting the appropriate benefits back. So growing, lots of attention, not even close to there yet.
Yeah, and it's not just plants. We're also looking at what Indigenous insects, we might be eating as well. So obviously got the bogon moths have been widely consumed by some Indigenous communities. Well, maybe we can rear bogon moths, and so there's a project underway in collaboration with CSIRO looking at whether we can rear bogon moths, and now we're at a point where, because of the recent declines in the bogon moth population, that project becomes even more important, because maybe now it's not just about, is this a possible future food source? It's like, this project might be what saves the bogon moth if we can't understand and support these populations moving forward as a consequence of presumably climate change.
That's really exciting. Sounds like an important area. We have one more question up the back there.
Hi, I actually had a couple of questions in regards to some of the crops that you were talking about. So you mentioned that hemp was high in protein and omega-3s. Were there any other nutrients that it was particularly high in, or that any of these plants particularly high in, which could fill some gaps in nutrition or undernutrition in some populations? Secondly, how are some of these plants being utilised in foods? You said that they were. Could you give us some examples? And lastly, what seems to be some of the issues around the sensory evaluation of actually trying these plants?
So I'll answer the first one. As I said, hemp has 30% oil, which is the right omega-3 to omega-6. So you can already buy hemp oil. It's not very stable, and it doesn't have a very high smoke point, so it's best used in cold, salad dressings and all those things. The protein level is also very high. It has all the usual micronutrients, etc. But the issue at the moment is that you can only buy hemp hearts. That's the middle part. And I'm very passionate about people eating enough dietary fibre. And essentially what happens is the outside comes off. It gets hulled because it's actually a nut. And that bit gets thrown away. And that's the dietary fibre bit. So we really need to eat the whole grain to have that nutritional punch. But at the moment, you're not allowed to buy whole grain. You can buy flour, which is the whole grain ground up. But that's not we'll get there. And then plantago, as James mentioned, we have some that have the most amazing omega-3 to omega-6 ratios, which we're very excited about. Dietary fibre is a sort of common theme through all this. So a lot of these mucilages are also fibres, so they provide bulk. Some of them are fermented. So a lot of these crops have very good nutritional profiles. So I hope that answers the first question.
I'll add to that with, so whole seed is something that I'm very passionate about. Plantago is normally milled to remove the psyllium husk, which is about a quarter of the seed. The rest of it's thrown away. Again, it's full of nutrients. The same thing with hemp. The hull is full of fibre. And a lot of my work has been involved in around incorporating whole seed flours into products like breads. So we've, for example, found that you can replace up to 15% of the wheat flour in a loaf of bread with hemp seed meal. and it makes quite a nice wholemeal bread that also seems to be quite resistant to staling, which is another benefit. But yeah, adding them into products that aren't sort of traditionally nutritionally poor, like wheat breads, is a lot of what we can do with these kind of seeds.
Fantastic.
I think coming back to the sensory component, often it's around, like as consumers, if we've got new products that are out there, it's understanding how you incorporate it into a food or into a meal. You know, how do you use it? If I come not so much from the plants but from the insects, you know, I might know where to go and buy some crickets, but well, maybe first I need to know where to buy the crickets, and then it's, are they going to be fresh crickets or are they going to be roasted crickets? Are they whole crickets? Are they ground up crickets? And when I've got the crickets, how do I keep them? Do I put them in the fridge or do they go in the pantry? And then when I'm cooking with them, how do I use them? Do I swap something else out, or do, you know, instead of putting beef strips in, am I going to put the crickets in and make a stir fry, or am I using it to make pasta? So this is part of the problem that we have at the moment. It's where do you go? What are you getting? How do you use it? Part of the biggest problem is these are, from an insect point of view, is it's very difficult to get it. It's easiest to buy it online, but then you need to know how to incorporate it. So there are more and more companies that are starting to produce things like cricket pasta. We know how to store pasta. We know what to make, how to cook pasta. We know what to put with pasta. It becomes easier for people to make use of it. So from that, I guess it's a preparation, a sourcing, how to incorporate it into our meals. But hopefully, the more that we can introduce people to these sorts of novel food products, the more we start to see it taken up in supermarkets and in our regular meals. And coming back to what Rachel said earlier about trying to get protein into diets, you know, the idea of, you know, older people like to eat pasta, they like to eat bread, they like to eat biscuits and cakes, as do small children. I have a little person at home. I have no problem getting him to eat pasta. So if we're having problems getting them to, you know, getting enough protein into people's diet, this might be a more viable way of doing it, along with the myriad of other amazing nutrients that are present in insects and other foods, other plants.
Absolutely. What a great note to finish up on. We have come to the end of our allotted time, so could you all please join me in thanking our fantastic panel speakers tonight. Thank you all very much again for a fantastic presentation and a wonderful discussion. And thank you to you very much, our audience, for your attendance tonight, for viewing, and for your fantastic questions and comments. Do be sure to sign up for our mailing list in order to receive the latest information about Research Tuesday's related news. Thank you all very much for tuning in once again, and we hope to see you next time. Good night.